All right. The next section we want to talk about is industrial toxicology. And basically, the industrial toxicology is the science that studies the poisonous or toxic properties of a particular substance. In our world, we have millions of chemicals. From an industrial hygiene standpoint or in industry, you can have inventories of 50, 60,000 different chemicals. And with respect to those chemicals being regulated, however, we see that from an occupational standpoint, only about 600 chemicals are regulated and have any kind of toxic exposure data associated with them. So trying to figure out the toxicity of chemicals is a real challenge to the field of toxicology, because there are so many chemicals that are out there, and to do toxicity studies on those chemicals is not only expensive, but it's very time consuming. So that's why we only have a few hundred of the chemicals that in our world that are regulated. As we had mentioned earlier in our history discussion, a gentleman by the name of Paracelsus, and he's basically the father of toxicology, if you will, the person who coined the phrase, all substances are poison, there's none which is not a poison. The right dose differentiates poison and a remedy. So, pretty profound statement. In the field of toxicology, the definitions that we utilize is, first of all, toxicology is the science that basically studies the effects of certain chemicals or substances on the human body. When we talk about toxic effect, it is an undesirable impact on the physiological section that could cause an adverse impact on that organ that it's having an impact on. And those effects usually result from an overexposure to the chemical or substance. When we talk toxicity, what we're referring to here is that toxicity is the capacity or the capability of a material to cause injury or harm. So if something is extremely toxic, means that if we're being exposed to it, that it can cause harm to our body. Another term that we use is a hazard. A hazard refers to the possibility that exposure to that toxic substance will or has or can occur, and if it does, it will cause injury or harm. So, in other words, when we talk toxicity, you can have the most toxic poison known to man sitting here in a closed container in this room, and as long as it remains in that closed container, it's not going to be a hazard to us. It becomes a hazard when the possibility of exposure becomes real. In other words, if that bottle got knocked off the desk and it broke, now we've got a hazard. So that's the difference between toxicity and hazard. And finally, when we talk toxicant, that's just referring to that material or that substance or agent that can cause damage, anywhere from injury or death to animals and plant life. Some of the key elements of toxicity is how much are you exposed to? And when we refer to how much you're exposed to, we refer to that as the dose. And that dosage is going to be recorded in either parts per million or milligrams per square centimeter, or picocuries per liter, or milligrams per kilogram of body weight, or so on. There are various ways for us to express that dosage. Another key component of the toxicity of a material is going to be how long does the exposure last. Does it happen for only a moment or a few seconds, or continuously for hours and days, or weeks or years. The longer the exposure, the greater the potential toxicity of that substance can be. Other key elements when we're dealing with toxicity are the routes of exposure. How does that toxic substance get into the body? And there's 4 primary routes of exposure from a toxicological standpoint. One, and probably the easiest or most common, is through inhalation. And why is that? It's because we inhale every minute of the day. And if we've got airborne substances or toxic agents present in the air, they can easily enter the body through inhalation. Another means is through injection, where you actually can get injected with a toxic substance and it can have an adverse health effect, or it can have a good effect, depending on what the dosage of the material is. But in industry, injection doesn't occur as frequently as some of the other forms or routes of entry, because you have to come in contact with needles or syringes or jagged edges or something along that way, or lines, for the material to be injected into the body. So it's the least likely means of exposure to the industrial worker. Absorption, what we're referring to here is skin contact. Chemical substances or toxic agents can come in contact with the skin. And when it does, it can either do damage to the skin at the point where it comes in contact, or it can pass through the skin and get into the blood system and cause damage to various body organs through that mechanism. And then the 4th means of a route of exposure is through ingestion, where you actually take it in, ingesting it, and it gets into the digestive tract system and gets processed and then picked up into the body. Again, not as common of exposure route as skin contact or inhalation, but it does occur where workers are eating or drinking in areas where toxic chemicals are present, or working with toxic chemicals, get it on their hands, break for lunch, go have a sandwich or a cigarette. They can ingest those toxic substances that are on their hands in that way. So it is possible and feasible. But skin contact and inhalation certainly are by far the greater means of routes of exposure. And one of the elements of reducing toxicity is to implement controls to prevent exposure. And those engineering controls can be implemented anywhere from the source or the path or the receiver of that toxic agent. Well, one of the common terms that's used in toxicology is the concept of a dose response. And basically what we're saying here is that for a given dose, you can have a response. The higher the dose, the perhaps more dramatic the response could be. An example here is listed here as carbon monoxide. If you were exposed to carbon monoxide at 2 parts per million, you probably wouldn't notice any symptoms. It wouldn't affect most people. But at 10 parts per million, you're going to have some people who start getting headaches. At 25 parts per million, you'll have people get dizzy as well as headaches. At 100 parts per million, some people will not only get dizzy and headachy, but they'll become nauseated. And at 1,200 parts per million, most people will die within about a 30-minute time period. So you can see, as the dose changes, the response is going to change. You can kind of illustrate that on this graph here, is that at some point down here, we don't have any response. That's signified by NOAL, no observable action level. And then at some point, we start seeing responses. Here we got headaches, headache, dizziness, nausea, and death. And those responses increase as the dosage increases. Here's another graph of a dose-response curve. This is illustrating a percentage of mortality versus a dosage of a particular compound. And there's also a threshold concept, which basically says is that there is a dosage that people can be exposed to and not have a response. And it's the same concept of what Paracelsus recorded in his writings, is that there are certain doses of materials that can be medicinal, and in other words, will help you. Well, there's others that won't. And here's just a few examples of various responses, like aspirin. We have 325 milligrams. May not do any good. 650 will maybe help, and 1300 would be real good. Or you have different responses of somebody drinking beer. Drink 12 ounces, it may not have an impact on you. If you drank a 6-pack, you would probably have a very visible signs of being impacted, and if you drank more than that, you have obvious signs of being physiologically impaired or impacted by consumption of a beverage. So there's a variety of different examples here of dose responses. Again, the basic concept is dose increases, the response increases. We do have a threshold of no response that can be recorded. Well, in the field of toxicology, one of the common research or study basis is try to determine what is the lethal dosage of a particular chemical. In other words, what will cause the test population to die from that exposure. And that kind of helps them learn what is a dangerous level. A couple of the common terms that are used in toxicology studies are the LD50 and the LC50. The LD50 is the lethal dosage, which is ingested or injected into the test population, and it's the dose that will kill 50% of the test population. The lethal concentration, LC50, is that concentration which can be inhaled by the test population, and by inhaling it, it will kill 50% of those test organisms. You may encounter a term called LDN, and that's an oral, can be recorded either orally or through injection. It's a dosage in milligrams per kilogram on certain type of organism, and during a time of exposure. So what we're referring to here is that if you want to record the lethal dose of 10%, you could substitute 10 under that N and go about doing the study to determine that. Primarily when we look at toxicological studies, majority of the dosages are going to be administered through either oral ingestion, or they're going to be through injection, where we inject through syringe into the test population. And typically when that is done, the dosage is recorded as milligrams of the study chemical or substance per kilogram of body weight of the test organism. So milligram per kilogram refers to milligrams of toxicant versus a kilogram of body weight. If a dose is given which results in no death, to that particular exposed group, then it would be referred to as an LD0. In other words, at that dosage, there's no lethal consequences to the test population. Or you can also have an LD100, which would be where you administer a particular dose and it killed 100% of the test population. But most typically, we have the toxicology researchers utilize the LD50. With respect to lethal concentration, it has the same effect or the same concept as a lethal dose, LD50. The only difference is that your exposure is going to come through inhalation. We breathe it into the body. And so we would have an LC50 would be the concentration of that toxic material that we're studying that would kill 50% of that population. This is usually expressed in parts per million, parts of contaminant per million parts of air. Or you can also utilize milligrams of the contaminant per cubic meter of air. And oftentimes we'll see this expressed again in a related to a time process. So again, the dose response curve would look something like this, where you've got your percentage of responses on your vertical axis and the dosage and material, and you can see how we can plot the LD50 from this data. Typically, we'll use test animals to be our test population, because it's hard to find humans to volunteer to find out what kind of dose or concentration will kill you. We still get a lot of volunteers, so we have to use test animals to be able to do that. So when you look at your various forms of toxicity information, you will see it recorded like it's described here. For example, in the American Industrial Hygiene Journal, this one was described as a rat lethal concentration that killed 50% of the test organism, the rat, through inhalation, what the dosage was, and the time period that was involved. Down here we see the route of the entry was through injection through an IV, what the dosage was, and this is just a reference of where that toxicity information was recorded. So again, to review some of the other dose response terms, you can have TD low and TC low. That's your toxic dose low, which is the lowest dose for a compound that will show a toxic effect with the exclusion of radiation, or the lowest concentration to express a toxic effect via inhalation. You could have the LD lethal dose for the low, or the lethal dose 50, or lethal concentration low, lowest concentration in air, and lowest concentration will kill 50%. We also have the no threshold, which there's no observed effect. Those are usually referred to or illustrated on our graphs and charts as NOAL or NOEL, in this case the no observed effect level. And basically that's depicting the highest dosage that we can expose people to and not have an observable effect. And then you have the lowest observable effect, which is the very first time that we see any kind of effect on our test population. Well, frequently you'll see tables and charts that have been derived from different organizations and agencies to try to give you an idea or try to give a toxicity rating, because everyone wants to know, well, how toxic is it? And so here's just one example of a toxicity rating chart. Super toxic can be defined as something that through oral ingestion of rats less than 5 milligrams per kilogram body weight would kill them. And there's some examples over here on the example column. So you got a super toxic, extremely toxic, very toxic, moderately toxic, and then slightly toxic. Again, this is illustrating our routes of exposure. Inhalation and skin contact or skin absorption are primary routes. Ingestion is next, and injection is probably the least likely or common route. Basically, if you have a toxic substance, as I mentioned earlier, and that substance doesn't enter the body, then you're not going to have any hazard from exposure. If you can create a situation where it can enter the body, then you're going to have a potential toxicity effect. Prevention of entry of the toxicants is significant. As we had said, inhalation being the primary route of exposure for toxic materials. Hazards that can enter into the body through inhalation are gases and vapors and mists and particulates, fumes, etc., that we earlier defined. So looking at the hazards of the lungs, again, the major source of entry is through inhalation. Some of the responses from inhalation can either be emphysema, which is where the bronchial passageways start to lose their elasticity, makes breathing more difficult. Pleurism, where it's the loss of the lubricant between the lung and the chest cavity, can cause irritation and pain. Pneumonitis, which is an inflammation of lung tissue. Bronchitis is inflammation of the bronchial passageways. Pneumoconiosis, a very common word in industrial toxicology from an inhalation standpoint, basically means a dusty lung. Foreign substances get into the lung, and it can cause blockage and damage to that respiratory tract system. Pneumoconiosis, Greek word. Dusty lungs. It can cause toxic response, or it can be caused by non-toxic dust. When we talk about the particulate being toxic, it means that it has a physiological effect. When we talk about pneumoconiosis from a non-toxic substance, it doesn't necessarily cause any kind of physiological damage or change the structure, but it can hinder and impede the gas exchange and therefore do damage by blockage of that gas exchange process, which can lead to then damage of such things as the heart, like making the heart work harder. And a lot of times people who have severe cases of pneumoconiosis will essentially die from heart failure. Some examples of materials that will cause pneumoconiosis types of illnesses, a couple of the most common, quartz, crystalline free silica, which causes silicosis. Again, silicosis is when you get that crystalline free silica down in the alveoli, it starts causing cutting action, if you will, of the tissue in the alveoli. Well, it's just like anything else, is when you cut your skin, what you see happen over the course of the next few days or weeks is a healing process where that cut heals itself, but when it does, it forms a scar. Well, that same concept takes place in the lungs. A foreign substance like crystalline free silica gets down into the alveoli of the respiratory tract system. It causes cutting or damage to that surface area in the alveoli, and the body naturally tries to heal itself. And it does. It'll go in there and it'll heal, but when it does, it forms scar tissue at the point of where that occurs. Well, if that continues to happen, that scarring continues to happen, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you reduce the air exchange space available in the lungs. And because of that, scar tissue blocks that alveoli passageway. The gases can't diffuse across the cells and get the oxygen into the blood system. Well, your body, your brain senses a signal when it's not getting sufficient oxygen. So when the scarring from something like silicosis occurs, your body's not getting the right amount of oxygen. Your brain sends a signal to the heart is to say, pump faster, pump harder to get more blood into the body. And it tells the respiratory tract to try to breathe more, breathe deeper, to get more air in, which it can't do. And so eventually what happens is that this scarring leads to the heart working harder to the point of where you have heart failure. So you get situations like silicosis and asbestosis, where you have that scarring of the lung take place, and it leads to heart failure from exposure to those substances. For asbestos, though, it not only can cause asbestosis or scarring of the lungs like silicosis, it can also cause cancer. And it can cause either lung cancer or cancer of the lining, which is called mesothelioma, or asbestos can also pass through or get into the body system and cause stomach cancer. There's not a lot of cases, but a few cases that have been reported of stomach cancer from exposure to asbestos. Beryllium, again, it's a suspect carcinogen. Arsenic could cause lung cancer. Benzene causes leukemia, which is cancer of the white blood cells. And then cadmium can cause liver damage, lung damage, prostate damage. Particle size, as we had mentioned a few times before, is particularly important. As we said, the different types of contaminant, gases, vapors, fumes, dust, smoke, fibers, mists. For gases and vapors, we're dealing with substances that are molecular in size, just like air molecules. So they can easily get into the respiratory tract system and pass from there into the blood system. Fumes. Fumes are typically, from our definition, about 1 micron or less. So they can be entrapped into the deep regions of the respiratory tract. Depending on whether they're soluble or not, they can pass through the respiratory tract alveoli into the blood system, or they could stay in the alveoli region and do the damage in the lungs itself. Dust, again, the size of the particle is significant. When you have particles that are greater than 10 microns, they're going to be filtered out by the nose and the throat. When you have particles that are 10 microns and less, they can get down into the bronchial regions, and when it's 5 microns or less, they can go on down into the alveoli space area and do a majority of its damage in the lowest regions of the respiratory tract. Smoke, again, is going to be dependent on this particle size. As far usually the particle sizes of smoke is very small, so it can get down into the lower regions. Fibers, again, fiber size is going to have an impact. But asbestos fibers, for example, easily are small enough to get down into the alveoli passageways. Mists, likewise, can go all the way down into the respirable lower regions of the respiratory system. Again, quick review, gases, one of the 3 states of matter, basically can be changed into a liquid or solid by changes in temperature and pressure. Vapors are substances that are typically a liquid or a solid, but can be changed by temperature and pressure into a gaseous state. Fumes are those solid particles when material condenses in air. Aerosols, when we refer to aerosols, it could be either liquid or solid particles, usually anywhere from 1/10 of a micron up to 100 microns in size. Mists are liquid suspended droplets, usually around a 40 or 50 micron size. Smoke particles down to 1/10 to 1 micron, so they can easily go into the deepest regions. Fibers, again, can get extremely small. And then finally, dusts. The dust particle size is important, but also whether the composition of the dust can have an influence, whether it's an organic material or an inorganic material, whether it's soluble or non-soluble in water, and so on. As far as the effects on the inhalable contaminants, the contaminant can either affect the respiratory tract system directly, either by causing scarring or irritation or swelling or edema. Some examples of that are chlorine, ozone, caustics. So it's going to cause the respiratory tract system to be impacted. Or you can have those contaminants that are going to pass through the respiratory tract system. It may or may not damage the respiratory tract system, but can pass into the blood system and be carried throughout the body, and then can have impacts to other body organs that it comes in contact with. You can just see some examples here. Carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds can go in, affect the central nervous system. Cadmium can either irritate the respiratory tract system or cause damage to yellowing teeth and so on. Lead can impact the central nervous system, kidneys, and so on. The natural body defenses, again, are mucous membranes and cilia. And when materials are deposited in various regions of the respiratory tract system, it gets deposited in the mucus. And then it may or may not be engulfed by the macrophages. And then the cilia can move that mucus lining up through the movement of those hair cells. And eventually it gets into the tracheal area, throat area, and you will respond with a cough because it just causes a tickling sensation or irritation sensation. And it gives you a desire to cough, and you'll cough, and then you can then spit out that mucus substrate that has those contaminants that are trapped. If any of you have ever seen a smoker and all the contaminants that are contained in those smoking processes or products get trapped a lot of times in those mucus linings. And especially in the morning when a smoker first wakes up before they have a cigarette, they'll cough. And if you look at that mucus that they cough up, you can visibly see the signs of those contaminants being trapped. And that's the natural body defense that we have. Again, particle size, we've talked about. Ultrafine particles have a tendency to stay in the airstream. In other words, when you inhale and exhale, the particle is so small, it doesn't have a chance to get settled out. And the only way it can have an impact on the body is if through the air movement, it gets embedded or impacted from the motion of the air into the mucus lining, and then it can get entrained into the respiratory body system. Again, we mentioned white blood cells, phagocytes, those are the garbage eaters. As far as routes of entry for skin absorption, we refer to it as the second most common. Basically, the four things that can happen when you have a contaminant contact your skin as one, as the skin acts as a protective barrier and prevents the toxic substance from getting into the body. Or it can cause the point of contact on the skin to develop irritation or dermatitis. The other thing it can do is it can penetrate into the skin layers, and it can cause sensitization or cellular structure change in the area of those contact. And once that sensitization occurs, even the slightest exposure again to that chemical substance will cause a physiological response. So you become sensitized to that compound. Or the material can penetrate the skin, get picked up in the blood system, and get carried around through the body and cause damage to various body organs that it comes in contact with. We already talked about the skin is our second largest organ, being approximately 20 square feet, and it is one of our first primary barriers against toxic substance. It also protects us not only to chemicals exposures, but at temperature extremes, heat, cold, moisture. It can protect us against some forms of radiation, biological agents, and so on. We've pretty much looked, I think, of our anatomy of the skin, so we'll skip through that. The skin serves basically three primary functions. One is temperature regulation, along with the brain. It's able to either produce sweat to help us control hot temperatures, or it can cause the body to shiver to help us generate heat and have that heat stored into the body. It's also our primary defense against foreign substances that are present in the air, and prevents those materials from being taken into the body. And it also provides us with tactile sensations for pain, heat, cold, sharp objects, pointed objects, rough objects, etc. There's a illness or a skin disorder, if you will, that is referred to as dermatitis. And NIOSH has shown that dermatitis is one of the top 10 occupational illnesses that we see occur in the workplace. And primary part of the reason being is that other occupational illnesses are more difficult to detect. But for dermatitis, which is an irritation of the skin, it's visible, so we can see it happen. And so some people argue is that why it's one of the top 10 occupational illnesses is because it's easier for us to see than some occupational illness that may be damaging the liver or the kidney. So the causes of dermatitis, the skin is permeable to certain chemicals, and some chemicals can contact the skin and do damage to the skin. Others can pass through the skin, get into the deeper layers of the skin, or pass in through the body. Some chemicals, a good example of this is DMSO, can be absorbed almost instantaneously into the blood system. Another one is mercury. Mercury can fairly rapidly be absorbed into the skin. Toluene, it can be absorbed, but it usually takes a longer period of time of contact. And then you have other products, for example, barium sulfate, that you would actually have to have cuts in the skin for it to get and have entry into the skin. In the ACGIH TLV booklet that was published in 2005, it lists about 185 chemicals that have the notation skin in it. And anytime, and when you're looking at TLVs and you see the notation skin, that's telling you that skin contact can contribute significantly to your exposure to that chemical. In other words, it can penetrate, that compound can penetrate the skin and enter the blood system and do damage to the body. So that's just a way to flag a chemical if it is a significant skin contact problem. Some of the skin disorders can be broken down into categories such as mechanical, physical, biological, or botanical. Mechanical hazards are when we're referring to things that create from friction burns or cuts or abrasions or punctures, needle sticks, etc. Physical hazards are when we're doing damage from cold and high temperatures or heat, or in some cases through radiation. Ultraviolet light is a source of causing a physical damage from either from the sun or from a welding process or tanning salons, etc. Biological hazards are skin disorders that are caused from bacteria, fungi, parasites, insects, and so on. And then botanical hazards are those hazards to the skin that can be caused from some form of living plant life. Poison ivy is a good example. Certain fruits and vegetables or handling of those substances or flowers. Again, routes of exposure, skin absorption. Both sweating and high temperature can increase the rates of the absorption of materials into the body. Direct contact with the chemical certainly gives you a high potential of the chemical being able to get into the body. And so as a result of that, we want to utilize the use of protective clothing. As we mentioned, intact skin is a natural body defense. The epidermis prevents absorption and is a physical barrier to bacteria. Sebaceous glands will ward off bacterial and fungal hazards, and skin pigments will help prevent from ultraviolet radiation damage. Sweat glands regulate the heat. Connective tissue provides elasticity to help us prevent against trauma. And then our blood system, we have the lymphatic system, which is our immunological response to protect us against infection. Here's just a couple of pictures and diagrams of contact dermatitis. As you can see here, this is damage that's been caused, chemical damage to the skin, redness and the sores that you see here. Here's another photo of a chemical irritation that a worker or an individual has responded to. Here's one, allergic contact reaction. Notice the swelling and the redness and puffy around the eyes. This is one, photosensitization. There are certain chemicals out there that when you're exposed to the chemical, it will have a cellular response that when you're exposed to sunlight, your irritation will occur. So this is an example, and it's referred to as photosensitization, and this is an example of an individual who from a chemical exposure is now reacting once the sunlight hits their surface. This is another example of dermatitis that's you can see here is affecting the lips, the mouth area, and the tongue area to an individual.